group, so I'm like,
Wow.
I'm in the zone.
Yeah, some of the questions are probably going to be repeats. Okay, so should I just go first then? Is everything okay?
Yeah, sure.
Okay, so looking at your CV, you studied electrical engineering in your undergraduate and postgraduate. So why did you decide to study management for the rest of your academic life?
Yeah, so it was kind of a gradual transition in a sense. So I worked in manufacturing for a while, and so the funny answer is that I found myself analyzing people more than actually doing my work. The serious answer is that that was true to an extent. I really liked the diversity in my organization, both in terms of cultural diversity. So there were, I worked in Singapore, so there were Koreans, locals, Indians, Chinese, and there was also the diversity of what people wanted from what they were doing there. So if you know a semiconductor manufacturing setup, it's like there are different modules, and my role in that was integrating those different modules. So sort of working with that, a lot of what I had to do was achieving coordination amidst diverse teams. Of course, at that point, I didn't know I was doing that. I was just doing it as part of my job. At some point, I realized that there was a ceiling to how much I could go, how much I could grow in my career and not do something else. Like when I saw the principal engineer, he or she was doing like 4 projects of what I was doing one off, which meant I was just going to do more work, but not really grow that much. So I wanted to change. So I moved back to India, did my MBA, and I got introduced to this field of OB during my MBA. And then I realized that, okay, there's a lot of structure to all the unstructured thinking I was doing behind coordinating diverse teams. And that's what sort of prompted me to take it up as a field and actually study it in more detail. And of course, the decision was more to actually pursue a career of research first, and then the decision to do a PhD sort of came naturally from there.
Okay, so that's the reason how you got into this field. So
Yeah.
Another question is, how do you usually decide your topics, specific topic of your research? Like, is there any criteria, for example, like what's hot and your personal interest or something?
Yeah, definitely personal interest, right? Because I think any project is typically like a several year-long affair. So if you're not interested in it, you're not going to sustain working on it. I think apart from that, in terms of deciding what to study, it's a question of, it's got to be something that is of interest to organizations, right? So that's fundamental in a sense that that's going to drive my research question, that's going to drive the people that I'm going to talk to collect data. That's also an essential requirement to publish, which is obviously the main criteria for success in the field. So I think it has to be interesting for organizations. And I also think more in terms of, so one of 2 extremes from an organization perspective. One, it's either futuristic, so it's about advanced technology. It's about incorporating, AI into the workplace or voice assistants into the workplace, or it's something with an impact. So it's like working in the healthcare sector, for instance, working under uncertainty. So kind of like that's, I don't know if it's what I naturally gravitate to or if it's a criteria that I use, but it's more about, that's what excites me, because understanding something in those kind of contexts, which are a bit blur in a sense, unclear both for organizations and for researchers. So I love being in that space.
Okay.
I hope that helps.
Okay, and how many researchers are usually involved in a project, and what are each of their responsibilities?
Okay. So typically, I did do, so my dissertation was solo, but I'm finally now doing another project which is also solo, which is just me, which means I'll seek feedback at regular points in time, but I'm the one who's doing the reading, doing the data collection, doing the analysis, doing the writing. But typically it's usually like 2 to 4 researchers, and it depends on a couple of things what they do. So in some cases, somebody might approach me with an idea saying, hey, it'll be good to have you on the project because you have either the methodological skill or the domain expertise. So if it's, for instance, an idea on identity or teams, then they usually come to me because I bring something to the table. But in that case, if they brought me the idea and they're going to drive the project, then they're usually the lead on it. I'm just a second author. If it's 3 or 4 people, then sometimes it could be that it's a student-driven project and I need somebody else who has a specific expertise to guide the project. So I bring them on. So then the student's first, I'm second, that person's third. When I'm leading the project, usually it's about if a student is involved in the project and is going to help me throughout the project, then they come as later authors. But so that it's not very fixed in terms of who does what, but who does what is closely tied to the authorship order in the paper.
Okay, and what does a typical day look like for you?
Right. So there's no typical day, right?
Okay.
So as I was telling the other group, so I think there are 2 types of days. One is when I have teaching versus when I don't have teaching. So when I have teaching, it's fairly straightforward. It's usually teaching focused. I'm preparing for the class. I actually teach. And then at the end of the class, I'm like super tired to do anything else. So I sometimes have meetings or I just, go back and relax at home. On a non-teaching day is like when I'm doing research, right? So for most part, research, and that forms the majority because, I only teach like 4 months, 5 months in a year. So a research day, so I usually start my day very early, 5 o'clock in the morning. Put in a couple of hours, usually it's writing or analysis, and then I go drop my daughter off in the nursery. And then I have a slot in between where I come in, and usually it's a mix of analysis, writing, and meetings. So research meetings with co-authors and stuff. And then these days, since my daughter, the 3 to 6 is with her. So I don't do any work, and then after 8 I come back and do another couple of hours at night. So primarily most of my work involves, so writing is the longest part of the process. So most of my work involves writing revisions, and of course designing data collection.
Why did you choose to focus particularly on coordination in teams and how employees manage their work identities?
Yeah, so the coordination teams was where it started, right? So as I was telling you, so the diversity and how is it that despite the fact that people are diverse and people come in with different goals, how is it that coordination was achieved? So that was my question coming in to the field. Identity sort of came up later on, and there were several sort of motivations for that. One, of course, the fact that I really liked that literature. I really liked the fact that it had a mix of different kinds of methods to sort of explore what are people thinking about, how do they make sense of their work. I think it's a very geeky motivation in a way, because I also found that a lot of the work in that space tends to be Western literature focused, which meant that choice, the element of choice was like inherent in it. So you can choose who you want to be, which is something that coming from the East, I was like, that's not true all the time. It's not true of a lot of people, even within an individual, that's not true of all of the different identities they have. So given that, I was like, okay, let me collect data to sort of understand this mechanism. Like, how do people make sense or come to terms with the fact that they have choice or not with defining who they are at work? So yeah, so coordination was a practical choice, identity was a theoretical choice in a sense.
Are there any other subjects that interest you and might be the focus of other research in the future?
You mean within management or?
Within management.
So I think I will keep working on team processes and identity as the focus, like the sort of pivot. But I like working in the context is going to change, right? So I like working in advanced technology context. So interactions with advanced technology, how does that affect the workplace? How does that affect interpersonal relationships? so that brings in some element of AI and I won't say algorithms. I don't go that deep into the technical side, but AI and the process of decision making, the learning that's involved, machines learning and humans learning, and how those cycles sort of interact. So that would be a space that I would go in. And the second one, which is more again context based, which is basically impact context, right? So uncertain and impact context. So I do some work in healthcare now, and I see myself doing more and more work in that space because it has that element of social impact. So you're creating an impact onto society. So how can we improve that impact in a sense? So that's where I see. So I still keep the identity and teams as my basis because that's where my knowledge of the literature and my methods lie. And then I use that to explore different organizational contexts.
Do you think there is any relationship between your teaching and research stuff? Is there any intersections?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, I mean, so I've been fortunate that I've been asked to teach OBE across 3 different programs, actually 4 different programs now, which is helpful because I bring my expertise into the classroom. So it helps that I know the literature, I understand the literature. So even if I'm teaching topics like power or trust or culture, which is not something I research on, but I know the literature. I've read about it. I understand what's the latest in that space. But particularly when I'm teaching teams and leadership, I bring in my research to the classroom. I present the latest projects that I've been working on, what that adds to what we're talking about in the class. So I think there's definitely that overlap. Off late, I've realized that the reverse has started happening as well because I teach in the SIE program, the Social Innovation and Entrepreneurship program. So that sort of helps with that impact focus that I was talking about. So a lot of times, questions that students ask, the discussions that come up there, actually prompts research questions, which make me then take it back and say, like, okay, how can I study this more systematically? So
interesting. So
yeah.
students also give you idea.
Oh yeah, definitely, yeah, for sure.
Interesting.
Because their view of something, of a phenomenon, could be very different from mine, and that's the beauty of it, right? So that's where we add to the richness of what we know.
Exactly.
And so when will you consider your research as being complete?
Ooh, wow. That's a question that never came up in the other groups, so well done for it. It's a great question. I don't think ever, right? Because, so one reason is that we are one of the few disciplines that does research on another discipline. So if you look at physics, they do research in physics. If you look at healthcare, they do research in healthcare. We are management, we do research on organizations. And organizations exist independent of us. So as long as organizations evolve, research has to evolve, it has to change. Our theories of what we know about human beings is going to keep changing. So yeah, I don't think it would ever be complete. I think from a personal perspective, I've always said this, I just want to leave work one fine day and basically die on the tube. That's it. Well, not really on the tube, but you know what I mean? Like, I want to work till my last day. I don't think it's ever going to stop. And that's because I also really like what I do. So I'd like to keep doing it.
What has been your highlight as a researcher in the Department of Management and why?
Oh, nice. I think, so in the Department of Management, so okay, that's interesting. So I think a big highlight was obviously getting published and getting a first author publication. So that happened when I was here. I still remember when I got the news, I still remember the exact spot I was in Borehamwood. I was in a bus. That was definitely a highlight. I think, first of all, the fact that the work that you've put in sort of sees the light of the day, people are going to read it, and it's in a top journal. I think that was definitely a highlight. Other than that, I think every single time I get a positive feedback from my students, I think that's, it could be something like, that class was great, or that was really funny, or this really resonated with me with something I saw in my workplace, or mentoring students, like when students come back and say, like, or one of my students got placed in a PhD program at a top school. So yeah, all of those things. I think can't single out on one, but yeah.
And what's the hardest part of being a researcher?
Yeah, I think the rejections. So when you send stuff that you write out, and especially unjustified rejections or rejections where you feel that it was, you weren't fortunate enough to get the right team to review it. That has happened a couple of times. So. Yeah, I think that's the toughest part, because it's not so much, so when you get rejections where it's like, okay, yeah, that's great feedback, I can work on, send it around somewhere else. But sometimes you get feedback and there's like, it doesn't work because it's either unrelated or it's too vague, it's like not giving you any specific direction. So yeah, you rejected me, but you're not telling me exactly why. That really stings. So that's probably the hardest part.
So do you think the data collection part is hard? Because you just mentioned that as, researcher in management, we are learning about organizations, but we're not the organization leader. So you may need to collect data from them. So when you send a message to them, is that hard to collect?
Yeah, it's hard in a different way, right? So I think I've had reasonable success when I'm soliciting for data collection. Sometimes people have approached me to collect data and analyze it. I also collect experimental data, which is not as hard because we have a lab. It's getting harder because of a couple of things. One, data protection. So people are worried about, oh, you're coming in from outside, so you're collecting my data. What are you going to do with it? And the second reason why it's getting harder is interesting, because there are more and more PhDs who are going into the workforce. So companies, big companies especially, now have in-house experts who can conduct research, and they're like, why do we need someone from the outside? The motivations are very different. For us, it's more about contributing to theory and publishing, but for them, it's more about what directly affects the bottom line of the organization. So they'd rather work with them, which makes sense. But what that does is it makes us harder to go in and collect data. So yes, that's getting harder. But there are a lot of innovative ways to get around it. So big data, for instance. So I have a project which looks at data from Twitter. So we can use that data, right? So it's publicly available. So there's a lot more. So I think it's looking different from what it used to like 10 years ago. So far, it hasn't been that hard. But it is getting harder.
Okay.
And where do you see yourself in the future?
Ooh. How much in the future?
20 years? 30 years?
20 years, wow, okay. I think, a couple of things. I think one, if I've made a dent in the world of teams and identity, I think I should have done it by then, for sure. And it should be something like I was talking about, the theoretical motivation. So the fact that the face of identity literature looks different. I think that's something. Beyond that, it's more about on the teaching side, the fact that people who I've taught or who I'm teaching now sort of coming back to me 10, 20 years down the road and saying, hey, you made a positive impact on the way I manage, the way I lead people, because that's how our impact is precipitated, right? So we teach something to students in the class who then become future leaders and then who enact those principles and then who affect the lives of their subordinates. And I think there is a small element of institutional building as well. So I'd love to have contributed to the institution, both in terms of bringing in good people, developing good people. I take pride in mentoring students. So the fact that my students have been placed in good PhD programs or in good schools. So hopefully in 20 years I'll have like several students who've gone through that. Yeah, I think.
So I got a final question. So
Okay.
do you have any recommendations to us as a first year management students and undergrads? So what should we focus on? Like for example, if we're doing some research in our future academic life, or how should we be in our like management learning? So yeah, any
So
recommendations?
let me understand this correctly. So you're asking for what I would advise you in terms of if you were to pursue a career in research or
Just learning management in general.
learning management in
Yeah.
general. Okay. Yeah. So no, I think from the perspective of learning management. So I think two pieces of advice. So from learning management in general, I'd say be open. Treat each learning experience as a way of understanding this is how the real world is going to be, right?
Yeah.
Because you have very different perspectives in your class. You've got cultural diversity, you've got economic diversity, you've got political diversity. That's literally a microcosm of what the real world is, what the organization that you're going to work in is going to look like. So use this as an opportunity to engage. Use this as an opportunity to say, okay, I think that this is true, you think that something else is true, let's talk about why that's the case. Because you have the time now, you have the space now. That may not necessarily be the case in the real world. So be open to that dialogue, I think, in terms of learning management. Research, it's literally just being inquisitive. You just got to try, like, you've got to, if you some people are naturally that way, some people, you can develop that. It's like trying to understand, like, why is something happening this way? Or why is something that I expect should happening differently? Yeah, I think, and specific to management research is like, why are people behaving the way they do, right? So why are people motivated to do something? So I think that inquisitiveness is what keeps you keeps you driven in a sense. Like that's what keeps you going, because the minute you finish an idea and it's published, you're like, okay, what's my next idea? So there's never a dearth of ideas if you're inquisitive, because you're always finding questions of what you're seeing around you.
Yeah, to know the causes of things.
Exactly. Yeah. That's right. Yeah.
Okay, I think that's it in terms of the questions. We just want to
Cool.
say thank you for your time and
Thank you so
Yeah,
much.
thank you.
Yeah, you're
giving us the
welcome. You're welcome.
opportunity to ask you questions.
Of course. Yeah.
Okay.
It was nice experience for me as well. Yeah. Thank you.
Thank you so much.
Thank you so
Yeah.
much.